A new dawn had arrived. The city lights were still flickering, holding on to the last moments of night. Slowly, the sun began to rise. A man stood by the window, staring out quietly. His fingers gently brushed the scar on his palm, as if feeling the past in every quiet second, letting the silence mark the time. Carmi, Berzado paused for a moment as he entered the bar. He flipped the lights on, the soft glow filling the room. Slowly, he began arranging the tables, setting the plates and tableware in perfect order. Every detail mattered. The chairs were placed side by side, lined up in precision. He stepped back, taking a careful look at the setup one more time, making sure nothing was out of place. Then, once again, he glanced around the interior, making sure the view wasn't just right, but satisfied the privilege of excellence. A long time ago, his sister saw him off as he departed from Chicago. There weren't many words exchanged between them, but in her quiet way, she managed to slip some money into his pocket without him noticing. He endured countless grueling cooking sessions under the guidance of Michelin-starred chefs in New York, each experience sharpening his skills and pushing him to the limits. Every kitchen was a battlefield, every dish a test of precision, and every mistake a lesson burned into memory. Carmi learned the hard way under the relentless care of David Fields. An intense chef with an obsession for perfection, David tolerated no mistakes in his kitchen. Every second mattered, and he drilled that into his students with brutal precision, often resorting to harsh words to drive the point home. Carmi felt like he was constantly taking blows from a bully, but he couldn't deny how much he learned from the experience. One lesson stood out above all: label everything, literally. Andrea Terry taught him many lessons, and she didn't hold back. She cranked up that a chef should be both clean and fast, with smooth and deliberate movement. There was no room for harsh or careless actions in her kitchen. Precision was everything. From her, he learned that even a 5-second mistake could ruin the taste. Timing and finesse were the difference between perfection and disaster. While Carmi was away from home, a lot of things happened. His brother tragically took his own life, leaving a deep scar on the family. Though Carmi returned for the funeral, he couldn't bring himself to attend the ceremony. The weight of grief and guilt was too overwhelming. Meanwhile, his sister was pregnant with her first child, a bittersweet contrast to the family's pain. At the same time, Marcus lost his mother, adding yet another layer of loss to an already heavy time. So much had changed, but none of it shook his focus or his determination. Carmi was back at the bar, ready to reclaim the space as his own. He rearranging the kitchen, mopping the floor, and cleaning every surface until it sparkled. As he worked, he made notes, establishing a set of rules for his kitchen. The first point was non-negotiable, a declaration of his commitment to excellence. He didn't hold back. Every detail mattered. And, true to form, he labeled everything literally. Sydney brought him a warm cup of coffee, a comforting gesture. Carmi apologized for leaving her alone in the kitchen, acknowledging the weight of responsibility she had carried in his absence. He promised it won't happen again. He called Richie, but he could only leave a voice message. He apologized for the commotion in the past. Throughout the night, Carmi meticulously revamped the menus, pouring his creativity into every detail. On his notes, he sketched out each dish like a culinary art presentation, envisioning how he wanted them to come to life. He applied the sauce to the meat slowly and tenderly, ensuring every bite would be infused with flavor. After arranging the peas with great precision, he placed the meat just so, creating a harmonious balance on the plate. The presentation was simple yet elegant, highlighting the excellence of the ingredients rather than overwhelming them with unnecessary embellishments. Carmi dripped the blood-red fruit juice drop by drop, carefully ensuring a harmonious blend of colors on the plate. He measured each drop with precision, creating a visual balance that transformed the dish into a captivating masterpiece. Then he stepped back to admire his lineup of Michelin-worthy dishes, arranged on the kitchen island. In the early morning, Sydney was in the bathroom getting ready, trying to enjoy her morning routine when she heard her dad knocking on the door. He always had terrible timing. Too many Ricky's chicken wing had kicking on his stomach. Again. As she stepped out, her dad looking relieved and joke around. The usual morning routine. At the Bear, Carmi stood at the kitchen, carefully preparing ingredients. He used a pair of tweezers to meticulously place each green pea onto the plate, inspecting every grain with precision. His concentration was sharp, tuned into every tiny detail, lost in the rhythm of the task. Christopher was the second person to arrive in the kitchen after Carmi. He entered with a box of microgreens, causing a bit of noise as he made his way in. Despite the commotion, it didn't break Carmi's focus. They exchanged casual conversation, chatting about the prices of microgreens, Carmi's decision to quit smoking, and other random things. As Christopher Sugar was arrived. She greeted Carmi casually, but he barely looked up, still focused on counting peas with the same intense concentration he always had. After a brief back and forth, Sugar tried to check in on him, asking how he was and bringing up Richie and Claire, though the conversation stayed light and distant. They went silent for a moment before exchanging polite, good mornings, again, almost like a reset. Sugar admitted she wasn't doing great, feeling the weight of everything, especially with her baby due in 2 months. She wished she could just set everything aside for a while, but they both knew that wasn't how life worked. Ibrahim arrived next, offering a quick greeting without stopping as he walked straight to the back of the kitchen, slipping into his usual routine. Sugar, still in conversation with Carmi, picked up a note from the table. Carmi explained that it was his non-negotiables, a set of rules for maintaining excellence in the restaurant. Sugar teased him about how serious he was with his lists, but she couldn't help but admire his dedication. The doorbell buzzed, signaling Cicero's arrival. He greeted Sugar but barely acknowledged Carmi. Glancing up from his work, Carmi was a bit surprised and instinctively asked why Cicero was there. Cicero, never one to be questioned, quickly reminded him that as the owner, he could show up whenever he pleased. Carmi, knowing better than to argue, immediately apologized. Cicero's attention shifted to the corner of the kitchen, where a large piece of equipment, the new cryovac, stood. His expression soured as he questioned its necessity, his tone laced with irritation. Carmi calmly explained it was an upgrade, a better model that would improve efficiency. But Cicero wasn't convinced. He muttered about unnecessary expenses and the fancy new plates, viewing it all as frivolous spending. Carmi, ever respectful, acknowledged Cicero's concerns with a simple thank you and nothing more, knowing it was better to let it go. Still grumbling about the costs, Cicero made his way to his office, clearly unimpressed with the new additions. Sugar kept teasing Carmi about his non-negotiables notes, going through them point by point, poking fun and asking why he was being so strict. Carmi, sticking to his guns, didn't want to waste time discussing it. Part of Sugar felt a little hurt that he made these decisions without considering her, but she kept that to herself. Carmi reassured her that it was for the best, and in the end, she just had to accept it. Cicero showed up again, this time with a refreshing drink for Sugar. Carmi gave him a look, wondering where his own drink was. Without missing a beat, Cicero threw a sarcastic remark his way, telling him to get his own. Carmi just turned away, knowing it was better to let it slide. Sydney arrived just as Cicero was passing through the kitchen door. They exchanged quick greetings without stopping. She walked up to the kitchen island and froze next to it, overwhelmed by the lineup of Michelin-worthy dishes spread out before her. Staring at the plates, she felt a wave of mixed emotions, impressed, yet unsure of what to say. For a moment, she was lost in thought, until Carmi's voice pulled her back to reality. Carmi explained that the dishes were part of his R&D. He'd been working on remaking the menu and redoing everything from scratch. Sydney felt overwhelmed by how much had changed without her knowing. Carmi, however, didn't bother with long explanations. His focus was clear. He simply expressed his determination to bring a Michelin star to the restaurant. Sydney was taken aback by his seriousness. She never expected Carmi to dial things up this intensely from the start. Seeing her reaction, Carmi reassured her, telling her that her cooking skills were already excellent. The only thing left to do, he said, was to adjust the menu, and then they would be unstoppable. But Sydney wasn't convinced just yet. She carefully examined each dish, going over the changes Carmi had made. As she scrutinized the details, Carmi patiently explained the design of each dish, sharing the reasons behind every adjustment. Yet, despite his explanations, Sydney still felt it was all a bit too much. She couldn't help but wonder why Carmi was pushing things so far. Carmi told her the reason was simple, so they could push each other and reach the top together. Once again, Sydney was taken aback. There was still one thing bothering her, the idea of changing the menu every day. That would take an enormous amount of effort, requiring so much talent and time, and that was just for the kitchen. It didn't even account for the other aspects of the restaurant. When she asked about it, Carmi quickly changed the subject. He told her that he had set up a DocuSign for her. Sydney, still trying to wrap her head around the idea of changing the menu every day, struggled to understand what he meant. Carmi explained that it was a partnership agreement for her, himself, and Sugar, essentially outlining how much of the place she would own. Sydney remained silent, overwhelmed, trying to process so much information at once. As Sydney fell silent, Carmi popped a candy into his mouth. She couldn't help but wonder if he had finally quit smoking. He confirmed it, saying that every cigarette was just a waste of his time. Sydney nodded to herself, understanding now why the tension had been so high that morning. When she asked if he'd called Richie, Carmi turned away, avoiding the question. Sugar came back from her office, handing over the printed notes. Sydney glanced at the non-negotiables and asked about them. Sugar shrugged, saying she had nothing to do with it and left it to Carmi to explain. He gave a brief explanation, saying it was just a bunch of things to make the restaurant better. With a small smile, Sugar teased him and casually mentioned the DocuSign he had set up for Sydney. It was an exciting day for all of them, each lost in deep thought, except for Carmi. Richie arrived, the atmosphere tense as he joined the team. There was an unspoken tension between him and Carmi. Neither seemed willing to acknowledge the other's presence. Something was clearly off between them. Richie, avoiding direct conversation with Carmi, used Sydney as a go-between. He asked her casually if she'd seen his iron, but quickly added a jab, wondering aloud if she could also ask Carmi what had happened to his tables outside. It was obvious that the tables had been moved, but Richie wasn't about to ask directly. Carmi, not one to back down, responded in the same indirect manner. He asked Sydney to relay to Richie that he'd rearranged the tables for better efficiency, implying that Richie's setup had been less than ideal. It was an obvious dig at Richie's work, masked as a helpful gesture. Richie chuckled, knowing full well what Carmi was trying to say. Carmi, though, didn't stop there. He continued with his critique, throwing in a few more thinly veiled insults about the original layout. Richie laughed again, playing along, but the tension was thickening. The back and forth between the two escalated quickly, with both men using Sydney as a buffer to trade increasingly sarcastic remarks. Richie, ever the joker, even hinted at taking things further, but it was clear neither of them intended to back down. Sydney, stuck in the middle, had clearly had enough. She suggested, rather pointedly, that they stop before things got any worse. But Richie brushed off her concern, throwing yet another playful insult at Carmi, this time calling him out for using power phrases like some sort of corporate robot. Carmi, in turn, reminded Richie of an earlier apology, one Richie wasn't interested in accepting. As the exchange continued, it became increasingly clear that neither Richie nor Carmi was ready to let go of their grievances. Sydney, feeling overwhelmed, called for backup. But even Sugar, the usual voice of reason, wasn't willing to step into the fray, leaving Sydney to navigate the growing tension on her own. The bickering between Richie and Carmi kept going, neither willing to give an inch. Richie, feeling territorial, claimed his space. He made it clear that the area outside was his domain, his dojo, and any changes without his approval only created chaos. Carmi, unfazed, shot back that he had simply replaced a few 4-tops with 2-tops, brushing off Richie's concerns as nonsense. Richie reminded him that Carmi had been the one to bring in the 4-tops in the first place. Carmi, growing more irritated, mentioned he had also moved the flowers because the arrangement was over the top. Richie, not one to let it go, defended the flowers as being elegant as shit, adding to the absurdity of their argument. Sydney, still stuck in the middle, tried once more to calm them down, but Carmi's patience was wearing thin. He declared he couldn't keep apologizing, while Richie kept raising his voice, clearly enjoying pushing Carmi's buttons. The back and forth reached a boiling point, with Richie asking if Carmi wanted to get out of his face, to which Carmi coolly responded, still holding his ground. Sydney, exasperated, finally shouted for them both to shut up. Richie, in his usual fashion, dismissed the situation as textbook sublimation, a psychological term he casually threw around like it was nothing. Carmi wasn't having it and told Richie to cut it out, but Richie kept going, claiming he'd seen it all before. Suddenly, the lights flickered, and Sydney, now frazzled, joked about having a stroke from the stress. Just as things couldn't seem more chaotic, Sugar appeared, clearly annoyed. She asked them to stop yelling for just 10 minutes. Richie insisted he wasn't yelling, though the lights flickered again, adding to the sense of disorder. Sugar, now thinking something was wrong, questioned if she was having a stroke herself, but Richie and Carmi both pointed out it was just the lights acting up. Richie then mentioned that Fax brother were on the way, casually throwing out the plural as if it were common knowledge. Sugar, tired of the nonsense, asked how many. Richie guessed somewhere between 2 and 5. Frustrated, Sugar sighed, while Sydney tried to gather her thoughts. There were apparently 8 or 9 facts in total. Richie always forgot about one of them, adding yet another layer of absurdity to the situation. Finally, Sydney took control. She firmly told Richie that from now on, if he had any problems or questions, he should go directly to her. To drive her point home, she declared that from her perspective, Carmi didn't even exist anymore. After the tension calmed, Richie picked up the printed notes and asked Sydney what they were. Before she could fully respond, Carmi jumped in, sarcastically explaining that they were non-negotiables. But Sydney quickly shut him down, trying to keep things calm. Richie, confused, questioned what non-negotiables actually were, and Sydney, staying patient, told him to read the page. Richie, half-jokingly, admitted that some of the suggestions were things he'd have come up with himself, but scoffed at ideas like vibrant collaboration, calling it unnecessary. This led to yet another heated exchange between Richie and Carmi, with both of them tossing insults back and forth, telling each other to get fucked in increasingly absurd ways. Sydney, fed up, tried to stop the bickering by telling both of them off, but Richie ignored her, continuing to complain about parts of the list, especially the idea of changing the menu daily, which he found ridiculous. Carmi calmly reminded him that these rules weren't up for debate, but Richie kept pushing, turning the conversation into a back and forth about their different ideas on running the restaurant. As the argument dragged on, Sydney finally snapped, pointing out how both men had been yelling for 10 minutes and had given her a headache. She also noted how Carmi, in his frustration, had managed to make the entire situation about himself. Despite her best efforts to calm things down, the tension between Carmi and Richie kept simmering, leaving Sydney stuck in the middle of their endless dispute. In the midst of the chaos, Neil and Ted Fax arrived, with Neil carrying the iron Richie had been looking for. He handed it over, and Richie, not missing a beat, asked what Neil had been doing with it. Neil sheepishly explained that he'd wanted to iron his suit to look sharp, which Ted enthusiastically backed up. Richie, unimpressed, reminded Neil that ironing his fresco wool suit would only make him look like a stingray. As the lights flickered, Neil, confused, wondered aloud if he was having a stroke. Ted, always the optimist, suggested they go fix the lights and send out some vibes. Richie, still worked up, handed Neil the printed notes, sarcastically explaining that Carmi had instituted insane policies. Despite Richie's protests, Carmi brushed it off, calling Richie an asshole as usual. Caught in the middle like Sydney, Neil shouted for Sugar, who reassured him not to worry about the weird vibe. Curious, Neil looked at the notes, prompting all three, Carmi, Richie, and Sydney, to chime in, calling them non-negotiables. Carmi told Neil to open his mouth, then fed him a sample from one of the dishes. Just like that, the taste calmed him down, and he left with a smile. Ted climbed a ladder and began fixing the kitchen's electricity, while Richie noticed the meticulously labeled ingredient boxes. Amused by the overly detailed labels, he silently mocked them to himself. Meanwhile, Carmi grew frustrated with Ted working in the middle of the kitchen but quickly apologized, trying to stay calm. Richie, always quick to poke fun, found Carmi's apology amusing and continued teasing him. The kitchen chaos kept rolling. Richie and Carmi refused to back down, yelling at each other non-stop. Things quieted down for a bit when Tina showed up, but then heated right back up. The same thing happened when Marcus arrived. It was a temporary calm before the storm picked up again. The kitchen calmed down after Richie left to return to his post in the dining room, managing the restaurant. They had 8 hours left to prepare before their grand opening. Once things calmed down, Carmi approached Marcus and handed him the printed list of non-negotiables. He knew Marcus was probably feeling overwhelmed and didn't want to talk, but he wanted him to know that he and the rest of the crew understood his pain, even if they couldn't fully grasp it. Marcus acknowledged Carmi's gesture, saying the past few days had felt strange for him. He felt terrible, but in a strange way it was also good. He wasn't sure why, but he was working at the restaurant when his mother passed away, and it felt like that was how it was meant to be. He thought maybe his mom wanted him to be with Carmi and the team. With that in mind, he made a request to Carmi to help take them to the top. Carmi understood the weight of his words, and as he nodded in agreement, it ignited an even fiercer commitment to their shared dream. The Bear crew attended Marcus's mother's funeral. It wasn't raining. The day was peaceful. Marcus stood to give his speech, recalling how his mother had shaped his life so profoundly. His memories of her were vivid. She had been a constant presence, always guiding him with a steady hand, never allowing fear or uncertainty to take hold. She kept everything running smoothly, kind to everyone, and trusted him in small ways, like letting him watch R-rated movies as a child. As he stood there now, grateful for those memories, he recognized the love she had shared with so many, present in the people who had come to honor her life. At 5:29 p.m. in the Bear's kitchen, Sydney carefully added a spoonful of ice cubes to a large cup, filled it with Coke, and attached a label with her name on it. She walked slowly toward the kitchen island and took a sip, while Carmi looked over the restaurant menu in his hand. The menus looked slightly different, with wider margins, which Sydney had adjusted, knowing Carmi often scribbled in the margins. Carmi appreciated the small change, acknowledging her effort, and they both quietly prepared for the evening's service. Sydney ran through her mental checklist: Coke, tickets, Sharpie, everything was in order. Richie entered the kitchen, confirming that everything was ready on his end. With the final preparations in place, he stepped out, yelling to the staff to get ready as the restaurant was about to open. Sydney, taking a brief moment to scan the bustling kitchen, felt a mix of pride and anticipation. It was her turn to call the start. Confidently, she shouted, "Doors!"
Your turn, chef.
Come on, lizards! We're open!
Doors!
And the rest of the chefs echoed in unison. Right at 5:30 p.m., the Bear opened its doors. The orders started flowing in, and everyone was excited yet determined to deliver excellence. In the kitchen, the chef team worked with precision, managing to meet the demands efficiently. On the service end, things got challenging, but with Richie's creativity and quick decision-making, they were able to keep everything under control. As the day goes by, the high-intensity work began to take its toll. The first sign of trouble appeared when a customer had been waiting for their Wagyu steak for over half an hour. Tina had just finished cooking the dish and handed it over to Carmi for inspection. However, after examining it carefully, Carmi wasn't satisfied with the quality. The dish didn't meet his expectations, and he made the call to refire it. This decision didn't sit well with Richie, who disagreed with Carmi's assessment. To him, the dish was perfectly fine, and he felt that making the customer wait even longer was unnecessary. Tension rose as Carmi stood firm, believing the cook was off and refusing to let anything less than perfect leave the kitchen. Without hesitation, he tossed the dish into the trash, frustrating Richie even more. Richie, already feeling overwhelmed, saw this as a personal hit against his work, venting his anger and challenging Carmi's standards. Sydney, sensing the growing conflict, tried to calm Richie down by offering a solution, compensating the waiting customers with complimentary drinks to buy more time. Meanwhile, Sydney kept the kitchen moving, asking Marcus to prepare another dish quickly and encouraging Tina to work on the refired wagyu. Richie stormed back into the kitchen briefly, still frustrated, pointing out that he was being pushed to his limits. Carmi acknowledged the pressure, but the focus remained on maintaining the restaurant's standards. Tina, feeling the strain, apologized to Carmi, who simply urged her to keep going. As the time goes by, the bear started gaining more recognition, and orders began flowing in at a faster pace. With this surge in business came growing expenses, and Cicero wasn't happy about it. He approached Carmi with a bill in hand, frustrated by the rising costs. The most recent charge, over $11,000 for butter, had pushed him over the edge. Confused and irritated, Cicero couldn't understand why they were spending so much, jokingly questioning if it came from some rare, exotic source. Carmi calmly explained that the butter came from Orwell, Vermont, a small place known for its top-tier quality. Cicero, still agitated, mocked the expense, sarcastically commenting that he'd need to send a huge payment just for butter. He wasn't convinced, no matter how much Carmi vouched for its quality, and stormed back to his office in frustration. The kitchen was in full swing, with every hand occupied and no one available to run dishes to the front. Carmi called out for help, needing someone to deliver a broth to the customers. Neil, eager to assist, stepped up to the task, though unsure if he was fully prepared. Carmi gave him clear instructions. Take the broth to the table, pour it in front of the guests, and explain that it was their mirepoix broth. With confidence, Neil headed to the dining area, did exactly as Carmi instructed, and proudly returned to the kitchen, broth still in hand, wearing a big smile. But as soon as he walked back in, Carmi was baffled. Why was the broth back in the kitchen? Neil, thinking he had done his job perfectly, explained that he poured it in front of the guests, missing the crucial detail that the broth was supposed to stay at the table. Richie, having witnessed the situation, jumped in to help, taking the broth from Neil and heading back out. Carmi, still frustrated, couldn't believe what had just happened. His patience thinning, he reminded Richie that the restaurant needed to be organized, to which Richie sarcastically pointed out that Carmi himself was always changing things up. The tension rose, and soon both were yelling at each other, their frustrations bubbling over. As Richie led Neil out, he gave him a stern warning. Neil wasn't cut out for serving. Though Neil protested, recalling Richie's earlier encouragement, Richie made it clear this was a mistake he couldn't afford to repeat. Neil, deflated, simply nodded in agreement, realizing how serious the situation had become. As time went by, the bear started making headlines, with some media praising its excellence. However, there was a catch. Every day, the menu changed, and this began to burden not just the kitchen crew but everyone at the bear. Each day, the coordination between the service and kitchen teams grew worse and worse. There wasn't a day that went by without Richie and Carmi arguing, and their disagreements became fiercer with each passing shift. Financially, the restaurant was facing a heavy burden, as costs soared despite high sales. Cicero noticed the money flowing in, but he saw little of it left at the end of the day. Everyone at the bear was exhausted, they were all worn out. Sydney was about to get her own apartment, and she was with her father to check the place out. As they stepped inside, she could sense that her dad wasn't thrilled about it. He tried to mask his feelings, but the hesitation was clear. Sydney glanced at him, prompting him to share his thoughts. Emmanuel forced a smile and gave a vague compliment, but Sydney could see right through it. She knew he thought the apartment was small and overpriced and that it would mean a longer commute for her. Despite her dad's reservations, Sydney felt confident. She reminded him of the raise she was set to receive. Still, Emmanuel pressed her about the partnership agreement at work, wanting to ensure she had all her bases covered. Sydney felt frustrated. The details were still being finalized, and she hadn't received the final document yet. Emmanuel pointed out the thin walls, expressing his concern about the apartment's quality. Sydney dismissed his worries, assuring him that everything was fine. But her father wasn't convinced. He seemed more worried about her rushing into this new chapter. Sydney knew he cared, but she also felt determined. She had already signed the lease, and there was no turning back. With a resigned sigh, Emmanuel suggested they look for a couch. Sydney mentioned wanting an L-shaped one, but he insisted on checking out secondhand stores. She didn't mind. She was ready to make this space her own. Tina was in charge of buying the vegetables and had a shopping list in hand as she navigated the market. Spotting Jerry, she greeted him with a smile and exchanged pleasantries. As she looked around, she noticed the selection of vegetables seemed smaller with each visit. She asked Jerry about it, and he confirmed her suspicion. He explained that the growing season was winding down, which meant fewer farms and less variety. Once, she could fill her basket with everything needed for a full menu in one trip, but those days were becoming scarce. Tina absorbed Jerry's words, a newfound understanding washing over her. She repeated his phrase, "Whatever grows together, goes together," with a smile, appreciating the wisdom in it. Jerry nodded in acknowledgement, and with gratitude, she thanked him before continuing her shopping. Chi-Chi stood at Ibrahim's window, casually taking in the scene. He called out to Ibrahim, who was busy with something on his table, assuring Chi-Chi he'd be with him shortly. As Carmi walked by, he spotted Chi-Chi and greeted him, warning him to keep the smoke away from his window. Chi-Chi, engrossed in what was happening at Ibrahim's station, ignored the comment and continued to scrutinize the mess around them, cigarette in hand. He glanced at Ibrahim's chaotic setup and couldn't help but voice his frustration. The clutter was overwhelming, and it gave him heartburn just to look at it. He emphasized the importance of making a sandwich look appealing. Fluffy, not stuffy, he insisted, a mantra for him. Ibrahim echoed the phrase, and Chi-Chi went on to rant about the state of the baskets, frustrated by how people often treated them. He reminisced about how things used to run smoothly with everyone in their roles, Chucky with the bags, Mikey at the register, creating a well-oiled machine. It was a time he compared to General Hospital, where everything flowed effortlessly. As Sydney stepped out of the train station, she crossed paths with Adam Shapiro, the chef from Ever's restaurant. He greeted her warmly, and she recognized him immediately. They exchanged a handshake, both slightly surprised and pleased to see each other. Their brief conversation flowed naturally, with Adam mentioning how nice it was to bump into her. He then hesitated before revealing that he had snuck into the Bear 2 weeks prior. Sydney was intrigued and asked how he managed to get past Carmen and Richie, to which Adam joked that they were too busy arguing to notice him. Sydney chuckled, finding his experience relatable. Adam assured her that despite the chaos, the vibe was perfect, especially since he was there with friends. He raved about the food, particularly a scallop dish that he described as lights out and fresh. Sydney felt a mix of pride and relief. She hadn't expected such high praise. When Adam mentioned that the dish felt new, Sydney clarified that it was a collaborative effort between her and Carmi. Adam nodded, emphasizing how great the food was. Their exchange shifted to the challenges of working in restaurants, with both acknowledging the madness of their industry and sharing a laugh about it. Sydney mentioned that this month had been particularly hectic, hinting at some inherited stress. Adam understood, and as they wrapped up their conversation, she realized she was running late. Adam admitted he was in the same boat, but not before inviting her to come by Ever's for a meal sometime. Sydney agreed, genuinely appreciative of the offer. As they said their goodbyes, both felt a sense of camaraderie, having connected over their shared experiences in the bustling world of culinary arts. As Sydney arrived at the Bear, she saw Marcus already deep into his pastry recipe research and Carmi busy prepping his ingredients. Carmi, while peeling and cutting fruit, accidentally cut his finger. He grimaced but continued working until Sydney noticed and offered to help. Without hesitation, they switched places, and she took over cutting the grapefruit, letting out a quiet sigh as she worked. Her attention then shifted to the menus scattered across the table. She glanced at them, noticing a small but significant change. The allspice was still there, but something was different. Carmi had adjusted the recipe by removing the habanero, which had been a key component. Sydney felt a twinge of frustration. The change wasn't about the pepper itself, it was about the lack of communication. She knew the dish might even taste better now, but that wasn't the issue. It was the constant back and forth between the front and back of the house, the decisions made without informing the rest of the team, that was slowly causing problems. Carmi fell silent, thinking on her concerns. He admitted there had been a communication lapse, especially since Sugar had just printed out menus based on what they thought was finalized. Sydney couldn't help but point out the obvious, that this disjointed way of working was what was hurting them the most. Carmi was guiding Tina through the process of preparing vegetables, explaining the details as they worked. He pointed out how to make precise cuts, showing her the spot known as the Pope's nose. Tina, curious, asked why it was called that, and Carmi, with a hint of humor, left the explanation up to her interpretation. As they continued, Sugar and Richie approached the group, interrupting the lesson. Richie, with a serious tone, asked Sydney why the Tribune was coming to take pictures. The question hung in the air, creating an uneasy silence. Carmi quickly realized the situation, muttering an expletive under his breath. Richie pressed further, wanting to know why Carmi reacted that way, and Sydney calmly revealed the truth. They were being reviewed. Tina, caught off guard, asked if it was happening that night, but Sydney clarified that the review had already taken place. Richie let out a sigh, realizing the gravity of the situation, while Sydney simply confirmed it, the weight of the moment sinking in for all of them. One of Carmi's non-negotiables was to break down all boxes before throwing them in the dumpster. Normally, this was something the Fact brothers handled, but today, it was Carmi's turn to take care of it. As he stood on top of the dumpster, breaking down the boxes, he started to regret ever putting that rule on the list. Each box felt more annoying than the last, and the task was more tedious than he remembered. Still, he kept at it, thinking to himself how it made sense at the time, even though it now felt like just another chore he could have done without. Sydney had been helping Marcus clean up his apartment, sorting through piles of old belongings. Marcus seemed overwhelmed, unsure of what to do with everything scattered around. Sydney suggested donating most of it, and Marcus, not feeling attached to anything, agreed. Once the cleanup was done, they sat on the stairs, catching their breath. Marcus thanked Sydney for her help, but there was something more on his mind. He brought up a past awkwardness between them, apologizing for making things weird. Sydney quickly brushed it off, assuring him it wasn't a big deal. The conversation then shifted to Marcus's relationship with his father, or rather, the lack of one. He hadn't spoken to him in a long time and admitted that his dad had never been much help, especially during his mom's illness. Marcus confessed he didn't even know his father and sometimes felt guilty for not wanting to. Sydney listened, reflecting on how much she relied on her own dad. She mentioned how her dad was always early to everything, something she realized she had inherited. They laughed about how she could never manage to be late, no matter how hard she tried, both acknowledging their quirks. The mood lightened as they began to joke about their shared experience of losing their mothers, forming a playful, dead mom club. They teased about imaginary meetings in dimly lit church basements, with Sydney pretending to be the one who took minutes at these gatherings. Through their banter, Marcus quietly mentioned that he wished his mom had been able to try his cooking, and Sydney reassured him that she would have loved it. Sometimes you could just tell. Carmi was working on his menu in the kitchen. A plate sat before him with meat and green sauce, carefully arranged side by side without overlapping. He turned the plate, examining it from different angles. For the final touch, he added fresh vegetables, placing them with precision. The presentation was beautiful, but it still didn't meet his expectations. He dumped it into the trash. As he checked his phone, he received the news that Andrea Terry was closing her restaurant, Ever. Richie was in charge of setting up the dining room for a photo shoot, with the Fax brothers helping him arrange everything. He directed them to adjust the placement of the glass on the table, moving it back and forth in search of perfection. Neil, growing frustrated, pointed out they had been repositioning the same glass for 15 minutes, but Richie insisted that the photograph would last much longer than that, so it needed to be perfect. As the tension mounted, Richie reminded everyone that the photographer would arrive in 40 minutes. Richie called out the remaining time to the room, ensuring everyone stayed on track. He then checked in with Ted, who was busy cleaning the floors. Ted's single machine was slow, but Richie urged him to work faster, reminding him not to get distracted. Richie repeated his demand, underlining the way of the situation. Richie, feeling the pressure, whispered to Neil, practically begging him not to mess up. Neil reassured him that they were all on the same page. The team knew how crucial this review was, and Richie's urgency made it clear that everything had to be perfect. Sydney and Carmi were working together in the kitchen, prepping for the day's menu. As they moved through their tasks, Sydney brought up the news about Chef Terry. Carmi, focused on his dish, brushed off the mention at first, but the conversation shifted when Sydney made a comment about a foam on a dish. Carmi wasn't sure how to respond, handing her the plate to taste. Sydney tried a bit and gave her feedback. It was good, but good wasn't what Carmi was aiming for. He wanted more. Sydney quickly clarified that the dish was actually excellent, but there was something about it that felt a bit too fancy, almost outdated. They joked about how certain flavors like mint jelly were considered old-fashioned, but a mint reduction? That still had potential. The conversation then turned to the night's pasta, with Carmi unsure until they saw what fresh ingredients Tina would bring back. They tossed around ideas and settled on potato gnocchi with beef cheeks, a combination that felt right. As they continued working, Sydney remarked on Chef Terry's career, noting that it was pretty incredible. Carmi agreed, but when asked if he knew the place was special while he was there, he admitted he was often too busy to fully appreciate it at the time. Uncle Cicero brought in Nicholas, computer marshal, to assist with the Bears' finances. Sydney greeted them, offering her hand, but Nicholas, true to his nickname, simply introduced himself as Computer. Sugar arrived, surprised at Cicero's early appearance, and he quickly inquired about Carmi, who joined them soon after. The atmosphere was charged, and it was clear they were all eager to dive into the numbers. Cicero was upfront about the struggles many restaurants face, admitting they weren't doing well in several areas but also acknowledging some successes. He was ready to get to the point, so he instructed Computer to enhance their findings. Computer shared insights from their month-and-a-half of operation, clarifying that the data didn't factor in previous expenses. Carmi chimed in, suggesting there hadn't been much unnecessary spending. But Cicero playfully pointed out that Carmi was known for finding trouble in finances. Cicero encouraged Computer to proceed with the analytics, reminding him to take his time with the numbers. As they discussed microgreens, Computer suggested using less due to high costs, which Carmi and Sydney confirmed was possible. However, when Computer questioned the high research and development costs for menu development, it became clear that frustrations were mounting. Carmi, feeling annoyed, snapped back, questioning the point of the analysis if it was just going to result in recommendations to do everything less. Cicero pulled Carmi aside for a more serious talk. He laid out the reality of his financial investment in the restaurant and made it clear that if things didn't improve, he wouldn't hesitate to take drastic measures. Carmi accepted his point but expressed his desire to lead effectively, prompting Cicero to clarify that he appreciated leadership but not at the cost of being disrespectful. Returning to the kitchen, Cicero asked where they had left off. Computer had a list of cost-cutting suggestions, such as sourcing produce more economically and reevaluating the floral and linen budgets. They debated the need for extra black napkins, with Cicero admitting he liked wearing black. Then Computer shifted the conversation to wine service, insisting that wine pours be reduced and costs managed. He glanced at Carmi, puzzled by the presence of a phone when they didn't take reservations over the phone. It led to a discussion about efficiency, with Computer questioning the purpose of certain practices like using chargers, plates set at tables before guests arrived, highlighting their redundancy. Carmi and Sydney nodded in agreement, realizing that they needed to streamline operations. Computer wrapped up by noting their service turns per night, suggesting they should consider opening for an extra day to boost efficiency. They all understood the stakes and were ready to make the necessary changes. A long time ago, Tina faced a tough patch in her life, desperately searching for a job. One day, after receiving yet another rejection, she wandered into the beef, hoping to find some solace. All she wanted was a cup of coffee, but luck had other plans. The owner was absent, and Chi-Chi decided to give away an Italian beef sandwich for free. Tina ended up snagging one and found a quiet spot near the arcade to enjoy her unexpected meal. As she took the first bite, tears began to flow down her cheeks, a mixture of gratitude and sadness washing over her. The kindness from the staff touched her deeply, making her sob without even realizing it. Meanwhile, in the arcade, Richie, Mikey, and Neil were engrossed in a game. Mikey caught sight of Tina, noticing her tears. Concerned, he pointed her out to Richie, who shrugged off the situation, claiming he hadn't said anything to her, just offered her a sandwich. Neil chimed in, confirming that she was genuinely crying, which prompted a light-hearted exchange among the three about their game and Mikey's reluctance to approach her. Richie urged Mikey to say something to Tina, worrying she might scare away the regulars. After some playful banter, Mikey hesitated but eventually made his way to her, unsure of what to say. Tina, still catching her breath from sobbing, wiped her tears as Mikey approached. He joked about the sandwich being the cause of her tears, and she reassured him that she was fine, laughing lightly through her sniffles. Mikey acknowledged he had seen her cry, and Tina downplayed it, insisting she wasn't sobbing, just feeling overwhelmed. Mikey leaned back, ready to share some of the chaos that came with working at the beef. He started with the infamous toilet in the back, a nightmare that seemed to have a mind of its own, constantly exploding and turning the floor into a rotting mess. It was equal parts depressing and disgusting, but that was just the tip of the iceberg. Next, he dove into the frustrations with their delivery company. The terms had changed from net 45 to net 30, which was a real headache. He had been hoping to negotiate for a net 60 instead, but now they were stuck discussing payment plans. Mikey also mentioned the staffing issues. The team was stretched thin, and tensions ran high. With everyone constantly overwhelmed, the overall vibe was just off, leaving him feeling pretty down. Tina listened, amused by his tales but also relating to the stress he described. She finally chimed in, sharing her own struggles. Her landlord had raised the rent significantly, her husband was stuck waiting for a promotion that seemed impossible to get, and she had recently lost her job. She had been applying everywhere, but nothing was clicking. At 46 years old, she felt the weight of it all. Mikey chuckled at their shared experiences, and when he asked if there was more, she admitted that she also couldn't remember the last time she had a good night's sleep. They both laughed at the absurdity of it, and while Mikey tried to lighten the mood, she couldn't shake the heaviness she felt. Just then, Mikey's phone buzzed, and he shared a picture from his brother Carmi, a talented chef. The image sparked a moment of levity as they both tried to decipher what was on the plate. Mikey admired his brother's passion, talking about how Carmi always knew exactly what he wanted in life and excelled at it. Tina couldn't help but dream aloud about that kind of certainty. Mikey then recounted how their family business had been opened by their father, who had abandoned it, leaving behind a trail of unpaid bills. They both shared a chuckle over the all-too-familiar theme of fathers bailing out. Tina pondered the question of her dream job, feeling a mix of uncertainty and vulnerability. She admitted that she didn't think she had a dream job, feeling like she wasn't particularly good at anything. Mikey related to that, acknowledging he had skills but wasn't stellar at any one thing. As they sat together, Mikey reminisced about a childhood field trip to an old, beautiful Art Deco building filled with different businesses. He recalled the sight of people in suits and dresses, each seemingly on their own journey. To him, it felt like a building of dreams, but the thought quickly turned somber. Tina asked what kind of dreams he meant, and he elaborated that each person had a singular dream that led them to that job. Yet, he found it deeply depressing, realizing he was just a kid who felt destined to miss out on such opportunities. The weight of responsibilities loomed over him, crushing any notion of chasing dreams. Silence fell between them as they both contemplated their paths. Tina broke the quiet, revealing she had worked at the same place for 15 years before being let go. Mikey acknowledged the harshness of that experience, sensing the pain in her words. As Tina continued, she expressed her frustration with the job market. Every time she applied, she found herself surrounded by younger candidates, kids who seemed fresh and full of ambition. Mikey sighed in agreement, recognizing the struggle all too well. But there was something beautiful in their youthful eagerness, Tina noted. They seemed hungry for opportunities, filled with a passion she felt she had lost along the way. Mikey nodded, understanding the sentiment. It struck him that maybe they had both drifted from that sense of hunger, caught up in the challenges and disappointments of adult life. Tina felt the weight of the world pressing down on her, anxious about paying rent and the constant struggle to buy groceries. The reality of everyday life often felt overwhelming, and it was tempting to feel angry toward the younger generation. They seemed so carefree, oblivious to the challenges that came with adult responsibilities. Yet, in a moment of honesty, she realized that beneath that anger was a deep envy. She would give anything to be young and unburdened, to live without the weight of stress that came from years of responsibilities. The harshness of her job search loomed large. It felt almost comical how difficult it had been for her to find work. She was ready to do whatever it took, whether that meant washing dishes, cleaning floors, or selling whatever she could. She knew she had to cover her bases. Tina didn't crave inspiration or a life filled with passion. Her only desire was to provide for her child. All she wanted was a simple routine that would allow her to fulfill her responsibilities. Mikey decided it was time to lay his cards on the table. He knew the restaurant could feel like a chaotic mess. It had its share of yelling, greasy smells that lingered long after leaving, and a general sense of madness. Despite that, he also knew there were moments of pure joy, laughter, and camaraderie that made the hard days bearable. The pay wasn't much, but on good nights, tips could add up nicely, giving a sense of satisfaction that outweighed the rough patches. He glanced at Tina, sensing her uncertainty. He wanted to make it clear that he was looking for a new line cook. The thought of formalities like resumes felt unnecessary. He had already seen enough of her character in their conversation, and he didn't need a piece of paper to decide if she could fit into the chaotic world of the kitchen. Mikey wanted to invite Tina into that world. As they exchanged names, he introduced himself as Michael Berzatto, noting the connection they had formed, however brief. With Richie still hollering in the background, the noise of the restaurant became a backdrop to their conversation. Mikey felt grateful for the moment they had shared, and he hoped Tina would give the idea of working there some thought. He wished her to enjoy her sandwich, sensing that it brought her a moment of comfort. Tina took a bite of her sandwich, the flavors mixing with the relief of the conversation. Tears welled up in her eyes, not from sadness but from a sense of hope in the midst of her struggles. Adam and Sydney sat down for dinner together. The conversation turned to Terry, the owner of Ever, the restaurant where Adam worked. News had spread that she was closing it down, and the shock hung in the air between them. Adam pondered the news, surprised yet somehow not completely taken aback. He couldn't shake the feeling that this change was, in a way, a blessing in disguise. If Terry hadn't decided to leave, he realized he might have stuck around forever, stuck in the same routine without any real ambition to break free. He felt a sense of clarity wash over him. The closure of Ever forced him to confront his own desires and aspirations. It was the push he needed to move on and explore new horizons. His mind raced with possibilities as he envisioned a new venture for himself, one that would allow him to take charge. He thought about Sydney and the potential for her to join him in this new chapter. He could see her talent and passion, and the idea of her being part of his future restaurant excited him. He could hardly contain himself as he envisioned the two of them working together, bringing their unique ideas to life. The concept of a partnership began to take shape in his mind. He imagined offering her the opportunity to lead, to create the environment she had always wanted. The specifics rolled off his tongue as he laid out his vision. An $80K stake to start, benefits, and a clear agreement that would put both of them on the same level. As he shared his thoughts, he could see Sydney's surprise morph into intrigue. The prospect of starting something new, something that would be entirely theirs, sparked a light in her eyes. It was a big step, but Adam felt confident that she would appreciate the opportunity he was offering. He wanted to move quickly, but he also understood the weight of the decision. It was important for both of them to consider the implications. The thought of reaching out to Carmi was in the back of his mind, but first, he needed to gauge Sydney's interest. In the kitchen, Marcus was engrossed in Carmi's journal, flipping through the pages filled with notes about cooking. His eyes landed on a photo of a group of renowned chefs, and he paused, captivated by the image. Just then, Carmi walked in, greeting him with a casual morning nod. Marcus pointed to the photo, eager to share his discovery. He asked if Carmi recognized the chefs. With a knowing smile, Carmi identified them: Nobu Matsuhisa, Daniel Balud, and Thomas Keller. The realization struck Marcus. These were culinary legends. He marveled at the thought, feeling a mix of excitement and inspiration. Curious about the photo's origins, Marcus asked where it came from. Carmi shrugged, admitting he couldn't recall but thought he might have cut it out of a magazine. To Marcus, it felt like firepower, a spark of culinary genius captured in a single moment. His curiosity continued to bubble up as he stumbled upon the legerdemain in the journal, wondering about its meaning. Carmi explained it referred to the French concept of sleight of hand, emphasizing the magic needed to elevate a dish. Marcus imagined the dynamic between those chefs, picturing them pushing each other to new heights. Carmi shared his thoughts on legacy, reflecting on how chefs not only crafted dishes but also influenced who they worked with and where those ideas traveled. He described how elements from one restaurant could find their way into another, creating a web of culinary connections, much like a family tree. Marcus nodded, beginning to grasp the depth of what Carmi was saying. Just then, Sydney entered the kitchen, and Carmi welcomed her warmly. She apologized for interrupting but received compliments on her appearance, brightening the atmosphere. Curious about their conversation, she asked what they had been discussing. Marcus mentioned legacy, prompting Sydney to joke about her focus on simply getting through the week. Her lightheartedness brought a smile to everyone's faces. As she turned to Carmi, she inquired about his own thoughts on legacy. Carmi admitted he often tried to avoid the topic, but if he were to leave something behind, he hoped it would be devoid of panic and anxiety. He reflected on the importance of being at peace with his past and filtering out negativity to create something meaningful. Turning to Marcus, Carmi sought his perspective on legacy. Marcus thought for a moment and expressed his desire for his legacy to be one of resilience. Someone who kept his chin up, listened, learned, did honest work, and was fun to be around. He humorously added that he'd also want to be remembered as an excellent emergency contact. Carmi chuckled at Marcus's sentiment, telling him it sounded legendary. Chi-Chi and Chucky returned to the beef sandwich stall, a place where they once thrived as the original crew when it was still called Beef. Now, under the new name Bear, Ibrahim was running the stall alone and often felt overwhelmed by the demands of the busy kitchen. Seeing him struggle, Chi-Chi and Chucky decided to step in and help out. Chucky quickly established a rhythm, explaining how the process should flow. He demonstrated how to prepare the sandwiches. Each one needed to be wrapped in a napkin, placed in a bag, and handed off to the customer, all done quickly and efficiently. Chi-Chi picked up the pace, showing how to keep things moving fluidly. As they organized the workspace, Ibrahim raised a question about silverware. Chi-Chi and Chucky agreed that dealing with silverware would just slow them down, especially since it meant extra cleanup. With a sense of camaraderie, they reaffirmed their focus on getting the orders out quickly. Chucky outlined the different types of sandwiches they offered: hot and sweet, and dry. He noted the importance of keeping it simple and efficient, especially when it came to sides like chips. However, when the topic of mayonnaise came up, Chi-Chi couldn't help but poke fun at Chucky for having dealt with a customer who had requested it. Chucky recounted how he had provided the customer with a side of mayonnaise and told them to enjoy it at home, all while lamenting the mistake he felt he had made. Chi-Chi playfully criticized him for opening the door to mayonnaise requests in the first place, and the two shared a laugh over the mishap. With a strategy in place, Chi-Chi suggested stacking giardiniera cups by the window to improve efficiency, noting that a smaller cup could stretch out the giardiniera for more customers. Feeling energized, Chucky declared it was time to get started. As Chi-Chi opened the service window, he called out, ready for the next customer to step up to the stall. One of Carmi's non-negotiables was to break down all boxes before throwing them in the dumpster. Normally, this was something the Fact brothers handled, but today, it was Sydney's turn to take care of it. As she jumped on top of the dumpster, breaking down the boxes, she started to regret forgetting to remind the Facts not to play around too much. Sugar was shopping at a convenience store. As she loaded her bags into Car's trunk, the baby inside her belly started kicking, really, really hard. Sugar was gripping the wheel tightly as she drove along the highway, her breath quickening with each passing moment. The baby inside her was kicking up a storm, adding to her already mounting anxiety. The constant blare of car horns around her only made things worse, like a relentless, pounding rhythm in the background. She fumbled for her phone, trying to get some help. Each attempt, though, was met with frustration. Pete's line went straight to voicemail. So did Sydney's. As she kept driving, her desperation grew. One by one, every name she tried seemed unreachable: Carmi, Marcus, Richie. No one picked up. It was like the world had conspired against her at the worst possible moment. Her heart raced. Sweat dripped down her forehead as her phone stubbornly continued calling the wrong contact, misinterpreting her commands. She was nearing the point of breaking down, frustration bubbling over into helplessness. Finally, she decided to give up on reaching anyone else. One last attempt, calling her mom. In the hospital parking lot, Sugar was walking slowly, struggling with each step toward the entrance. Her body felt heavy, every movement labored, as if the weight of the moment was pressing down on her. From a distance, Donna, her mom, spotted her and immediately started running over. Donna was in a full sprint, clearly excited and overwhelmed. Sugar, catching sight of her, groaned inwardly, bracing herself. Donna's enthusiasm was the last thing she needed right now. Donna reached her in a flurry, trying to help but unintentionally making things worse. Her attempts to guide Sugar's breathing turned into an awkward rhythm that only added to the stress. Donna was breathing in exaggerated patterns, he, and Sugar, already on edge, was desperately trying to calm her mother down. Every breath Donna took seemed to heighten Sugar's anxiety. She wanted a calm, peaceful moment, but Donna's energy was anything but soothing. Finally, Sugar, barely keeping it together, pleaded for her mom to just stop. Donna, realizing how overwhelmed Sugar was, finally backed off, though the excitement in her eyes hadn't faded. The chaos quieted, for a moment. As they continued walking toward the hospital, Donna began her rhythmic breathing again, trying to coach her daughter through the moment. Sugar shot her a tired glance, already sensing where this was headed. Donna kept up her pattern, as if it would magically calm everything down. Sugar's frustration flared. This wasn't helping. If anything, it was making things worse. Sugar's patience was wearing thin as Donna, ever determined, insisted her breathing method was calming. But each breath Donna took only seemed to rile Sugar up more. She could feel the stress building, her mom's overenthusiastic coaching pushing her closer to snapping. Donna persisted, convinced she knew best. Sugar, trying not to lose it, was on the verge of screaming. Finally, she couldn't hold back anymore. With her frustration boiling over, she begged her mom to stop.
Hey, shut the f*** up!
Sugar eventually made it to the hospital, despite all the chaos. The delivery went smoothly, and relief washed over her. The moments that followed were filled with a mix of exhaustion, love, and a strange peace that settled between her and Donna. There was a lot said between mother and daughter during that time, words about their bond, memories shared, and the complicated love they had for each other. Donna, for all her overbearing ways, stood by her daughter's side, and somehow that made all the difference. The episode, though intense, wasn't about restaurants or cooking. It was about family. If you're expecting kitchen drama or culinary chaos, well, you'll have to rewind and check episode 2 again. That's where the food stuff really kicks off. For now, the story shifts to what's next, another chapter in the whirlwind of their lives. On to the next episode. One of Carmi's non-negotiables was to break down all boxes before throwing them in the dumpster. Usually, the Fack brothers handled this chore, but today things were just normal. Neil and Ted were there, helping Carmi tackle the mountain of boxes. As they worked, exhaustion hung in the air. Ted complained about how tired he felt, while Neil echoed the sentiment, agreeing that the task was a drag. Carmi reminded them that if they stuck to the schedule laid out in the non-negotiables, this wouldn't be such a hassle. Ted argued that they did their part, breaking down boxes every time new shipments arrived. Then, out of the blue, Ted mused about the possibility of this being a haunt. Carmi dismissed the idea, insisting that there was no reason for any ghosts to bother them. Neil chimed in, questioning why they would be haunted at all, but Ted insisted that Sammy was always annoyed with them. Carmi noted that if anyone was upset, it could only be Claire, but Ted argued that she wouldn't haunt them. Instead, he joked about Claire being a piece of ass, which prompted an eye roll from Carmi, who insisted that Claire was all about peace. Amid the banter, Ted teased Carmi about still having feelings for Claire, suggesting that maybe she was haunting him. Carmi shook off the idea, unwilling to entertain it. Neil then encouraged Carmi to just apologize, suggesting it was easier than he thought. Ted played along, pretending to be Claire while Neil acted as Carmi, pretending to apologize. But Carmi wasn't interested in their little skit. He simply wanted to focus on breaking down the boxes. As they continued, he glanced at the brothers, half wondering if maybe, just maybe, he was being haunted by his own thoughts about Claire. Ted grumbled about the boxes, labeling them as stupid. The bear was under pressure. The media reviews were a mixed bag. Some praised their efforts, but most expressed disappointment. Inside the kitchen, the chef crew was overwhelmed by the demands for both quantity and quality. Coordination between the service team and the kitchen had turned into a complete nightmare. One night, long after the restaurant had closed, Carmi remained in the kitchen, focused on researching ideas for the upcoming menus. Sydney was still there, tired but keeping him company. The kitchen was quiet, save for the soft sounds of Carmi flipping through his notes. They were both exhausted, and it showed in their slow, tired conversation. Carmi mentioned how the expo was wearing them down, and Sydney half-jokingly offered to trade stations again, but that would only shift the problem. Carmi, already absorbed in his work, insisted that he'd eventually figure it out. Sydney, sensing something deeper, asked if he was really okay. Carmi brushed it off, saying he'd crack the issue soon enough, but Sydney wasn't talking about the menu. She asked again if he was good, offering to stay and help if needed, but Carmi told her to go home and get some rest. He repeated the words, as if trying to convince himself that it was the right thing to say. Tonight had felt off, Sydney noted, correcting him by saying it had been off for a while. Carmi apologized, admitting that sometimes it was hard for others to keep up with him. Sydney acknowledged that it wasn't about skill, hinting that there was something else she wanted to talk about, but then decided it could wait. They sat in silence for a moment before Carmi reminded her that the restaurant was closed the next night for a funeral service at Ever. It was a heavy event, but also a gathering of important people in the industry. Carmi invited Sydney to attend, noting it would be her last chance to eat at Ever, but Sydney hesitated. She didn't feel like it was her place to be there, but Carmi insisted, saying she should come. After a pause, Sydney agreed, though it was clear the decision weighed on her. Carmi, seeming to wrestle with his own thoughts, told her that he didn't want to make it so hard for people to keep up with him. Sydney acknowledged it with a simple okay, and then said good night, leaving the kitchen. Alone, Carmi stared at the dishes in front of him. After a moment of quiet contemplation, he carefully examined them, and then, without hesitation, dumped them into the trash. Neil somehow managed to slip inside the hospital where Claire was working. He wandered through the halls, asking if anyone had seen Dr. Claire Bear, until he spotted her at her desk, focused on her work. With his usual awkward charm, he approached her. Claire, startled to see him there, whispered in disbelief, asking what he was doing. Neil, unfazed, explained that he had told the staff downstairs he was sick so he could sneak in. Claire, concerned, asked if he was actually sick, but Neil admitted he wasn't. Then, with a rambling urgency, Neil got to the heart of his visit, Carmi. He tried to explain that Carmi didn't know how to tell her how he felt, but Neil was sure that Carmi loved her, even if he couldn't express it. Neil began recounting memories from high school, as if those moments could somehow explain Carmi's current emotions. Just as Neil was in the middle of his explanation, Ted also found his way into the hospital. Annoyed, he confronted Neil, accusing him of leaving him behind. The two bickered in front of Claire, who was now visibly frustrated by their presence in her workplace. She loved them both, but they had to leave. Ted, however, continued his story, mentioning how he had accidentally walked into an operating room and saw something gruesome. Claire, trying to keep her composure, asked them to lower their voices, reminding them that they were in a hospital. But Ted, like Neil, couldn't resist bringing up Carmi. He assured Claire that Carmi was all in, even if he hadn't reached out to her yet. Neil chimed in, recalling moments where he had seen Carmi happy, like on a school trip where they were supposed to go canoeing. It was clear to Neil that Carmi cared deeply for Claire, even if he struggled to show it. Neil and Ted rambled on about how Carmi could take care of her because of his strength and how he needed someone to look after him in return. Claire, overwhelmed, kept insisting she couldn't handle this conversation here, in the hospital. She appreciated their concern and love but had no idea how to process it. Neil, in his heartfelt way, told her she was the piece for Carmi, but Claire wasn't convinced. She repeated that she didn't know what to do, unable to offer a clear response to their emotional declarations. Before they left, Ted threw in a random question about someone named Diane, which clearly irritated Claire. She told him to get something checked, referencing a conversation they'd had with someone named Kelly, and with that, she ushered them out. Some of the Bear crew were attending the funeral dinner for Ever, Andrea Terry restaurant. Many legendary chefs were present. Conversations flowed between the guests, but Carmi's eyes were locked on David Fields, his former mentor. He still held a grudge against the man. Andrea Terry stood before the room, preparing to give her speech. She couldn't help but smile at the familiar faces gathered around her. Despite the formality of the occasion, she felt at ease. As she began, she kept things light and casual, making a joke about forgetting her spoon and pretending to rely on her Rolex for time. It was a small moment of humor that broke the ice, drawing smiles and chuckles from the crowd. Thinking back on her journey, Andrea admitted to never imagining herself in this position. She recalled her early days in the kitchen, working as a garde-manger at a brasserie in London. It was an open kitchen, meaning she could see all the customers as they entered, and, somewhat unnervingly, they could see her too. She had spent 7 years in that place, eventually working her way up to CDC. Over time, something truly special began to happen. She watched families come in, bringing their children, who would grow from kids into teenagers, and from teenagers into adults. She witnessed milestones, people getting married, having kids, and coming back to celebrate more moments with their growing families. It wasn't just about the food, it was about the connections made over time. Andrea shared how people often talked about restaurants, their history, the impact they've made, the chefs who worked there, and the awards they've won. But in her experience, what mattered most wasn't the food itself. It was the people, the relationships built over time, the faces that came back again and again. Those were the things people remembered, and for that, she was deeply grateful. With that, Andrea expressed her thanks to everyone present, feeling overwhelmed by the warmth in the room. Jessica was managing the kitchen, the atmosphere was busy, with orders constantly flying in. Next to her, Richie stood, observing the organized chaos as Jessica directed the team with ease. She called out orders, ensuring every dish was on time, reminding the kitchen staff to stay sharp and efficient. The team responded quickly, acknowledging her commands with respect and focus. Richie, in a quieter moment amidst the bustle, wondered how Jessica managed to stay so energized and motivated. He watched her move through the kitchen, handling pressure with a calm confidence, and couldn't help but feel curious. He noticed how she always seemed surrounded by people who pushed her to be better, both at work and in life. It wasn't about some hidden secret to success, just the way she carried herself and stayed driven. As they continued working, Richie thought that maybe there wasn't a grand formula for staying inspired. Jessica simply surrounded herself with the right people and maintained a mindset of growth. It was something that felt natural to her, but to Richie it seemed like the key to staying pumped up. Carmi, Sydney, and Luca were savoring their dishes, impressed by both the presentation and the flavors. The meal had a nostalgic quality for Carmi and Luca, who had once worked together at Ever. The food brought back memories, and Luca couldn't help but comment on it. As they enjoyed the meal, Luca remarked how he and Carmi had spent countless hours shucking peas during their time in the kitchen, turning them into efficient, almost robotic workers. Sydney joked along, calling them shell-shucking robots. The dish, once a symbol of repetitive labor and exhaustion, had almost become a form of culinary trauma for them. Luca laughed, admitting that despite the tough memories, he now created a dessert version of the dish, sweet pea panna cotta. It was his way of repurposing the past, turning something difficult into something beautiful. Sydney chuckled, recognizing the irony. Amidst the laughter, Luca noticed Carmi was distracted, staring intently at someone across the room. He asked if Carmi was okay, but Carmi was lost in thought. When they pressed him, he admitted he was staring at someone. David Fields, a former mentor and a notorious figure in the culinary world. Carmi's disdain for Fields was clear. He rattled off a list of reasons why he couldn't stand the man, from his toxic behavior to his inexplicable hatred of black pepper. Fields had been one of the best chefs in the world, but his harsh methods had left a lasting impact on Carmi, both mentally and emotionally. As Carmi watched, Fields began to rise from his seat. Without hesitation, Carmi got up, clearly intent on confronting him. Sydney and Luca exchanged glances, both knowing this encounter was unlikely to end well. They called after Carmi, but he was already making his way toward Fields. With a sense of inevitability, they resigned themselves to watching what would happen next, neither of them holding out much hope for a positive outcome. In the alleyway, Carmi finally encountered David Fields, the chef who had played such a pivotal role in shaping his career. It was a meeting Carmi had envisioned many times, wondering what he would say if he ever got the chance. Now, standing face to face, he could only muster a mix of resentment and disbelief. David greeted him casually, as if the weight of their past was nothing more than a passing thought. Carmi, however, was filled with unresolved emotions. He wanted to tell David off, to express the anger and frustration he'd carried for years. The memories of grueling days in the kitchen, the constant pressure, and the toll it had taken on his mental health rushed back. Carmi had ulcers, panic attacks, and sleepless nights to show for his time under David's mentorship. David, on the other hand, saw things differently. He believed he had done Carmi a favor. To him, the harshness had been necessary. He had taken an average chef and molded him into something excellent. In David's mind, the pressure, the sacrifices, and the pain were just part of the process. It had worked, hadn't it? Carmi was successful, standing in front of him as proof of that transformation. As David turned to leave, satisfied with his own justification, Carmi was left standing there, grappling with his thoughts. The encounter hadn't gone the way he expected. He had come looking for closure or perhaps an apology, but instead, he was given an explanation that he wasn't sure how to feel about. After a moment, a strange smile crept across Carmi's face. It wasn't joy, but maybe a sense of understanding, or at least acceptance. David was who he was, and in the end, Carmi realized he had become who he was too, partly because of that. So, everyone heads back to Sydney's apartment for an impromptu party. Everyone except Carmi, that is. The Bear crew joins in, and it's all singing, dancing, and, of course, elevating frozen waffles with caviar, because why not? On Sydney's fridge, there's a clip of newspaper review of the Beef, the Italian sandwich shop she helped Carmi turn into this fancy fine dining spot. In her head, she's running through memories of Marcus, Tina, Sugar, Fax Brothers, Carmi, and the whole Bear family. And you just know Chef Terry's words are echoing in her mind. It's the people they remember. She steps outside, suddenly overwhelmed, and starts having a panic attack, freaking out over a big decision looming over her. Meanwhile, Carmi is out for a solo walk when his phone starts buzzing with missed calls. 4 of them, from Uncle Jimmy. You know, the guy who funds the Bear but has been told to cut his losses and stop the bleeding. Last time they talked, Jimmy couldn't bring himself to spill the beans about how rough things were financially. But now there's a Google alert from the Chicago Tribune, and the review is finally in. Carmi's heart races as he scans through his phone, zeroing in on words. So, where does this leave our favorite restaurant crew? Not much gets wrapped up by the end of season 3. Sydney is still stuck trying to decide if she'll stick around at the Bear and fight for that Michelin star with Carmi, who, let's be real, has turned into a pretty toxic leader thanks to his personal baggage. Or will she bail and go lead a rival kitchen with Adam? And what about Carmi? Can he shake off all that trauma and step up to be a real partner to Sydney? Or is he going to let the cycle of abuse keep dragging him down, pushing away the one person who's got his back? The tension's thick, and it's hard to tell where it's all headed. That's the end of season 3 of The Bear. Subscribe for more videos like this, turn on notifications, and leave a like to help the channel out. Thanks for watching.